US, in its FTA, has got significantly GATS plus. GATS plus means more service sectors covered. The GATS is the General Agreement on Trade and Services. So the EU, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the benefits, economic benefits from Canada-EU FTA will come in the service sector for the Europeans. So the Europeans will be keen to see liberalisation of services. There are some common policies that should make negotiations easy. For example, neither Canada nor the EU wants to include education, health services, culture, for example. Those are common, so there won't be any real difficulties there. There's a bit of an anomaly in the scoping paper because it doesn't talk about financial services. Now, that may just be an official at the last minute thinking maybe it's not such a good idea to put financial services in. But it is a bit odd, really, because that's Canada has restrictions on banking, investment in banking, so it would be a bit odd not to include it. But again, the services say no sector and no mode of supply a priori excluded. Investment, this is not community competence. It's the member states that still negotiate on investment, but the EU does have what is called a common platform. And if you look at the EU-Chile agreement, you can begin to see the emergence of this. The EU is less demanding on investment than the US is in its FTAs. It doesn't look for a comprehensive investment agreement. It accepts positive listing. In other words, you only liberalize what you say you're going to liberalize, not the opposite, which is to say what you're not going to liberalize. I can answer questions on that if you want. But in the scoping paper, it talks about pre- and post-establishment national treatment. This is quite liberal, because this is talking about right of establishment. Pre-establishment national treatment means liberalisation. But it will be based on positive listing, so you can still exclude the sectors. You just list the sectors you want to liberalise, so you can go as far as you need to and want to. The other key issue is on investor-state dispute settlement, something that's caused real problems in NAFTA. Now, the EU position is essentially no investor-state dispute settlement. It goes for state-state dispute settlement. But I've heard that some Canadian investors in mining in Bulgaria and Romania would quite like to have investor-state dispute settlement, because there's no bilateral investment treaty, I don't think, between Canada and Romania and Bulgaria. There is with all the other new member states, but not those two. Public procurement, this is a key offensive aim of the European Union. It wants to see the provinces included, essentially. I won't go into any detail. And this is something that it will expect, otherwise it's a kind of deal breaker. On the Canadian side, you'd have to watch out for green purchasing policies in some of the European member states. And this affects timber exports in particular. Certified sustainable forestry labels may be required for certain public contracts. On TBT and SPS, these are the health and safety measures, technical standards. And essentially what the EU does here is to follow WTO rules, but it will then say we can implement these rules more effectively by setting up a bilateral specialist committee. Because you don't remove SPS and TBT barriers by an agreement. You remove them by a dialogue, mostly, and working on each specific case. And there are some important issues here. The Europeans are complaining about access to the dairy sector, difficult getting approval, SPS approval to sell cheese in Canada. And on the Canadian side, you have the GM, the genetically modified crops issue, of course, where the EU may cause problems. Commercial instruments, this is anti-dumping and safeguards. I'll skip that to save you that. On competition policy, again, this is part of the EU's comprehensive agenda, but there's already an existing 1998 bilateral EU-Canada cooperation agreement in competition, which covers most of the issues. I think there may be an issue in terms of provincial level support for industry, because European disciplines over the member states are greater than federal discipline over support in the Canadian provinces. Intellectual property rights, the EU here doesn't really push significantly TRIPS plus measures as the US does. It's not very aggressive, but the one area it wants to see progress is in GIs, geographic indicators. These are, the case in point is Parma ham, because the poor Italians, they can't export Parma ham under Parma ham label because it's been licensed in Canada. Someone else has licensed the name. And so the EU wants, this is part of the broader agenda, the EU wants to do this in all its FTAs, but it will be especially keen to do it in Canada, and it was in the EU-Korea agreement as well, so expect that to be one of the EU's offensive positions. And finally, to put you out of your agony on the detail, the institutional question is the EU usually sets up a bilateral councils, trade councils. As I say, it believes in state-state dispute settlement, not investor-state dispute settlement. So individual companies can't challenge whether the EU has complied with the rules, and vice versa. So the I'll skip the conclusions on EU policy, but just to conclude a bit on the Canada, EU-Canada FTA, there are economic gains, and I would say the prospects are better than they were in the trade and investment enhancement agreement, because this time Canada has gone out of its way to bring the provinces in. The problem with the trade enhancement agreement was that the EU didn't believe Canada could deliver the provinces. So part of the exercise of the past couple of years has been to ensure that the provinces and territories sign up to the agreement, which they have, apparently apart from Newfoundland, but someone can explain why that is the case. I'm sure you know better than I do, but it's something to do with politics, I'm told. I think the prospects are better. There are economic benefits there, and when there are economic gains to be had, you can always reach an agreement. It's then down to the detailed calibration, as it's put. In other words, who's willing to make which concession in which area in order to move towards your Pareto frontier of joint gains. Agriculture will be important, as will procurement, but there is room for scope for trade-offs between those issues. I wanted, just to wrap up the session, I wanted to say a bit about, it's slightly disjointed here, because I want to move back now to talk about EU external economic policy, and I wanted to talk a bit about the position of the EU in the international financial question. Because it's quite interesting, I think, if you compare this to the case of trade. If you look at what's happened in international financial markets in an EU context, first of all, there is, competence is rather split. In some areas, such as in monetary policy, you have European competence in the shape of the European Central Bank. But